think you've written a lot about getting on the same page without necessarily talking about getting on the same page. But just what are your thoughts on Gentelligence and getting on the same page?
I think it's what happens when we get sort of moved from this idea of tension
Mm-hmm.
or competition to
Mm-hmm.
one of collaboration. So to me, it's really what we're trying to do in those second two practices,
Mm-hmm.
where it's all about shared mission, right? To the same page to me means we're all pointed in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can understand that, then it allows us to kind of lower our defenses and say, oh, well, if you're heading the same place I'm heading, then I would love to hear your idea of how to get there. Maybe my idea is not working, right? Or I would love to know more about your thoughts, your tools. It's less threatening to me because I'm still going to end up where I want to go. And so to me, getting on the same page is looking at each other looking in the same direction as each other. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is so critical to getting on the same page. And I also think it's sort of the mantra of Gentelligence is that every generation has something to teach and something to learn. So if
Mm-hmm.
we just remembered that, then I don't have to know everything. And I also am more than, capable or valuable in terms of having something to teach. And I feel like that's the same page I would want everybody to get on, and to have organizations sort of normalize that in their culture.
I like that. I like how you closed that thought there. I think what you were saying was if we say to ourselves and can keep foremost in our minds that we have something to offer and something to learn,
Yep.
right? That could change interactions right there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does, it affects everything,
Yeah.
right? Because I think one of the biggest misperceptions we have in leadership, particularly as older people, and this has been more true for older generations I've worked with, is that we somehow got the memo that we're supposed to know everything,
Right. Right.
right? That the older you are, the more you're supposed to know. Expertise is positively correlated with age. And historically, the longer you had been alive, the more you knew, right? The better you were at everything. And then when the digital age came, it upset that dynamic, because suddenly, for one of the first times in history, on a very large scale, of course this has happened in the past, but on a very large scale, our younger generations were inherently learning as they grew up something that we as older generations had to acquire, right? We were the
Right.
digital immigrants,
Right.
not the digital natives. And so suddenly someone who's 20 is better at something than
Sure.
someone who's 60.
Sure.
Not permanently, right? That's a stereotype that older people aren't good at technology, but their engagement and interest level in it was higher. That they had a very sort of fluid knowledge of digital that was not available to us who grew up before it was invented. And so we had to learn it,
Yes.
right? And anytime you have to learn something versus just naturally acquiring it as you grow up, it's obviously a different learning curve. And so we didn't quite know what to do with that. That was a lot of the angst around millennials, was like, well, wait a second. Like, they're supposed to have to wait to know more than we do, or they're supposed to have to wait to be the experts. And somehow they got that before they were allowed to get it. And that's very uncomfortable and we don't like it. And so then we had this very negative, horrible, diatribe around shaming and blaming them because, who are you to think you know things that we don't know, even though they did? And it was just this storm of angst and
Yeah. It was
negativity, when if
tension
we
and
could
yeah.
step, it was tension. And Gen Z, I think, sort of saw it, and I honestly think OK Boomer was sort of their proactive, like, you're not doing that to
To
us,
me, yeah. Right.
but
That's good.
also not. I wrote a piece for NBC on this last year or the year before. Maybe it's been longer than that. The last few years have been a blur.
Yeah, I know.
But it was about the fact that, like, I completely understand OK Boomer, but that's not Gentelligent either, right? Because you're sort
Right.
of saying, I have nothing to learn from you. I'm going to put my hands over my ears and I'm not interested in
It
your
could be
input.
dismissive. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And that's not right either. But I think if we all could get on the same page, per your question, about the fact that I'm comfortable knowing that I have something I can learn and something I can teach, and that learning can happen
I like
with
that.
people older or younger, that's a very reachable place to
It
me. I
really
don't think,
is.
like you said, it's not hard. It's not,
No, there's
we're
nothing
not
very
asking
technical about
people to.
it.
No, it really isn't. But it's one of those things where, one of our reviewers said this is the missing link. Like, why haven't we talked about this or brought this out into the open and tried to figure out how to be better at this? And I just think it's a matter of, if you're very confident, it's easier to internalize the idea that you always have something to learn, and of course you're able to teach people. I
Good
think
point.
you have to feel secure, and you have to feel content and confident in your organization or in yourself. And when people aren't feeling that way, I think often it's because their organization maybe has given them reason to feel insecure. So, like, I think about our
Yeah,
baby
that's a
boomers
good
right
point.
now. I'm hearing from a lot of people who say, I was displaced, or I quit, or I got an early retirement, or, a severance package during the pandemic. I want to work. I'm healthy. I have a lot more to give. I can't get an interview because of my
Oh
age,
yeah,
or whether it's blatant or,
yeah,
more implicit bias, getting messages that, a company doesn't want them to come work because, they're older, and how many more years could they possibly have? And
right.
so, when you're getting messages like that, or you're working at a place that you feel like has sort of put you on that off ramp, you don't feel valued, you don't feel important.
Not at
And
all.
it's hard for you to be like, I have something to learn from a younger generation, because you're feeling threat. And when we feel threat, we're not going to,
Open.
I
We're
always
gonna
say
open up.
psychological safety is sort of like the ability to want to share your toys with other people. And I'm not sharing my toys with you if I think you're going to steal them
Right.
or
Right.
jump up and down on them.
Right.
And so you have to make people feel like, hey, we see you, we find you valuable, we respect what you're bringing. And then they can get to that place of feeling like they have something to learn and
Absolutely.
teach, I think.
Absolutely. And let's talk about that in terms of culture. But I really like that notion of offer, have something to offer and learn, and a same page about that. I got to think about that some more. I like the three, what'd you call them? Legs of a stool, or
Layers.
layers of
Yeah, layers of culture.
what we believe,
Yeah.
what we see, and then what we do. I'm sorry, what we believe, what we say, and then the third one was what we do and see.
So we pulled that from Shine's work in organizational culture, which is very classic foundational work in organizational culture. And Shine talks about the layers of culture being artifacts, so what we see, values, so our espoused values,
Right.
what we
Right.
say we care about, and then our underlying assumptions, so what we actually care about, sort of our fundamental beliefs. And so our adaptation of that really was,
Gotcha.
in a culture, what messages are people internalizing? And it's sort of like, if you think about, Lou, traveling to, again, another
Right.
culture, the first thing you're going to take in is what you see, right? What does the workplace look like?
Yeah.
Our senior leadership behind big heavy oak doors versus open floor plan versus whatever, foosball table and bean bags, or whatever people are seeing that we think speak to a certain demographic or generation. We saw this a lot maybe in the decade ago, when we were seeing everyone try to capture the millennials with their cool hip
Yep. Right.
workplaces,
Right.
right?
Right.
And we thought that was what was going to be appealing, and so we went with those, sort of seeing those artifacts. And then what we hear, right, this idea of what we say we care about. So
Okay.
really interestingly, right now I'm working with former student of mine to gather data on Fortune 100 diversity practices, because when we were writing our book, we found a study that basically said that only 8% of organizations have age in their DE&I strategies. And we thought, oh, that's so low. Like, how is that even possible?
Hmm.
And so it was from a while ago, though. It was from 2014, but it was the most recent one we could find. And so I've seen sort of updates on it, but nothing that I felt like was really that reliable. And so we're kind of combing slowly through, whatever's available. Not everything is available, but it's so fascinating because most places don't mention age on their DE&I websites. But if they do, it's like as a one word, in between all other kinds of difference. And very few of these companies actually seem to have any plan around it.
Sure.
So you might say, we value people of all ages, races, genders, all of
Exactly.
those things.
Exactly.
But then that's what you say,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then what do we see? Do we see that the mean age at our workplace is 32? Well, then I don't really believe you, right? That doesn't feel very authentic if you
Right.
say you value age, but,
Right.
clearly people aren't sticking around
Right.
much after, their mid 30s. And then
Yeah.
that fundamental assumption, what do we believe? Well, that gives root to everything else. If we believe there's a power in age diversity, then when we say that on our website, is it reflected in what you see around you, right? It's
Right.
all
Okay.
connected.
Gotcha. Okay. I'll offer this to you. It's another working definition of organizational culture that I use, which is a shared rationale for how we spend our time and our talent the way we do, and not some other way. The idea is a shared rationale for why we do what we do, but not something else. And that cuts in many ways across organizations, right? It could be by levels of organization, but it doesn't have to be. It could be by roles that could be spread across an organization. There's a mindset of lawyers have in an organization to protect against risk. And there's a mindset that an entrepreneur, or if there's an innovation unit in the organization, to try to take some chances. There's a shared rationale among some people about why they do what they do, and not something else. And it's probably clearer to them maybe than to others. I think they probably talk about it amongst themselves. Things could be implicit. Maybe it's just more explicit amongst a group of people who are sharing a rationale. But I thought about that when I read What You Borrow with Shine, those three layers. I think that if I did a lot of government consulting, and it was always widely thought that, truthfully, that the organizational culture is hard to change. But I'm not sure I saw a lot of people try to go about it the way I think it would produce change. I didn't see the kind of conversations about it that we're having, not that someone replicate our conversation, but that they talked about these kinds of things. That they talked about the difference between espoused and enacted values. That they talked about aspirations and then looked at constraints on people that came from the HR system, formal and informal reward systems, right? Where there's differences between what we hope to be and do and what we actually be and do, are and do, and for legitimate reasons. There's no criticism about that, but talk about it. If you don't talk about it openly, you never change it. If you talk about it more openly, you might find some things you can change and some things that are hard to change. I saw leaders mostly try to change culture by articulating what they want, the aspiration, what they wanted the culture to be, and believing they were providing cover for people to take chances and risks in moving in that direction. But they didn't really account for the realities of people's jobs and the constraints on people and the reasons why people did what they did and not something else. And the other chapter that kind of goes with the culture chapter was the people strategy. You covered a lot of ground. You and your colleagues, Megan, your co-authors, covered a lot of ground, from concepts to things like structure and framework of things to do, from things to say to notions like culture and people strategy, which are grand in an organization, but you broke them down. Like, who will your talent be? What will they need to stay committed? When and where will they work? Why will they work? Right, those are just great questions to ask, to have a conversation about, to hear how people from different generations in your organization answer them, or to hear how people from different parts of the organization answer them, different roles. Right, you don't know where your different points of view and perspectives are going to come from, but they're there. So they can be hidden from you, or you could surface them. And I think that these kinds of questions and the sort of the structure or process you put in some of these chapters for things to do really ought to be effective at surfacing those conversations, those what's on people's minds and hearts.
Yeah, I think with the people strategies, they're, like you said, if at the very least, it's a conversation point to have around, as we talked about, return to work. Where do people want to work? There aren't necessarily the generational divides on that we would think. research isn't supporting that, but it's an interesting conversation to have, even if to
Sure.
dispel the fact that there are, I saw all kinds of articles and got all kinds of questions about, is it true Gen Z doesn't want to go into an office? Is it true baby boomers can't wait to go back? And it's like, well, no, none of that's really true, but where are there interesting differences? And then even things like, another practical tool when it comes to people strategy, taking a look at your job postings, right?
Hmm.
So if we're in the middle of the great resignation or the talent shortage or whatever wave we're in at this very minute, it's hard to keep track. Looking at your job posting and seeing whether a critical eye would reveal that you're somehow signaling that really you do have a preference for a particular
Sure.
age of employees. So whether it's the fact that for as long as anyone can remember, your job posting for a particular role has said 5 to 7 years experience preferred, right? That is a very odd, I see that a lot,
Hmm.
particularly with HR jobs,
Hmm.
because my students, a lot of them go into HR, and even for entry level roles, there'll be this odd 5 to 7 years experience. And so they normally don't apply for those because they think, oh,
Not
they don't
qualified.
want us. And then 5 to 7 years also sort of signals to older people that that's not a role for them,
You're
because they might
overqualified.
think, well, I have 27 years, like maybe this is way below what I'm looking for. But if you ask someone in the organization, how did you come up with 5 to 7 years? I would guess 95% of the time they have no idea. They didn't write that job
Exactly.
description. They just cut and paste from the last one. Or sometimes it'll say like, a major or a GPA, which I can't remember what my GPA was. So if I was back on the job market and I saw an ad that was looking for, accounting and finance majors preferred, I would think, oh, this is for a college student who's
Now,
graduating, or anything like that, right? Like, what are you signaling that maybe you don't intend to or don't necessarily need to, because it's an artifact that we've
maybe,
just
yeah,
always included that.
maybe you don't even know you're signaling something. If you look at job postings, there's so many mismatches between them. One common requirement is a some kind of number of years experience. If you look closely, you might think that some of the sometimes I see such a long list of responsibilities. It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
that's not a recipe for success right there. No one can do 23 things in one job and be good at the job. That could be a mismatch with years of experience, because I'm not looking at something that says 25 plus years and can do all these things, and looking at something that's like 10 or 12 years and do all these things. And then sometimes it's interesting what's happened to titles, Mega, because I see in some government consulting I still do, resumes are a very important part of certain bidding on certain contracts. And sometimes the titles that are given out in organizations, VP is given out a lot anymore. There's a lot of VPs in organizations, not even very large organizations, where large organizations could have a whole structure of VPs. And you can look at it and go, they're looking for someone who's 30, 32, who's going to be a VP and have all this responsibility, and you're thinking, that doesn't quite add up right in my mind. You're raising a great question. Who knows what's intended? But I'm looking at some of these things thinking, I don't know that that's what the HR department, I don't know if they think, if what is being, how it's being read is what they think they're saying or what they meant to say.
Well, and that would be a good, whether it's a focus group conversation,
Mm,
right? And even think about, it's an interesting point you bring up. So, what assumptions do we have about a VP, right? So, obviously, those of us who grew up a while ago thinking VP, like you can't be a VP till
take some
you've
time
been
to get
there,
there, right, right.
right? Like I'm calling you out, Lou. I can hear you be like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like a VP when you're 30, like what is that, right? And so it could go a couple different ways. We don't know. One, it could be, are we manufacturing titles? I
Right.
advised for an organization a while ago where everybody was the head or chair of something and nobody wasn't. And I'm like, well, what does that mean when everyone is the chair of something? Like
Right.
then who's doing the work of the people on the committee, or,
Right.
what does being chair mean anything if everyone is a chair, sort
Right.
of a question. So there's that. Is
There's
that
that.
the
Yeah.
is that the new iteration of the trophy? Everyone gets a trophy, right? Hey, we can just make everyone a VP because maybe we can't pay them more, but if I call you a VP, that's
He's
worth
got some
something, right?
cachet.
Like,
Right.
I mean, there's probably an article in that. Like, is the middle management version of everyone gets a trophy, everyone is now a vice president. Like,
Right.
you'll see an article from me on that probably coming up. But there's that. But then there's also this idea of what's the value of having, if I'm 45 and I decide and I'm the president, what if I want a vice president who's 25? Because I think there's this great Gentelligent potential. Like, I co-authored my book with two former students of
Mm-hmm.
mine who are millennials. I think they'll probably call me and tell me I'm wrong. 27, I think, something like that now. And I got a lot of questions like, well, that's really nice of you. Why would you have them? And I will tell you, when we started, I thought, oh, this will be a great learning opportunity for them. Like, I did it from this sort of kindly place of mentoring and development, but like the joke was on me. Like, they taught me a ton. Like, the book was so much better. Like,
Mm-hmm.
originally they were going to just contribute, right? They were going to necessarily be authors, and they gave so much and made so much better through their perspective and sort of challenging some of the assumptions I
Yeah.
had
That's
going
great.
in,
Yeah.
that of course I had to give them, authorship. And so, is there a value in a 30-year-old vice president because we want someone to collaborate with a different perspective, or are we just giving out those titles willy-nilly and they don't mean what
No,
they used to mean? I don't know.
good
We
point.
have to look into that, right?
Well, that's a good point. It depends on the aim, right? It depends on the
Right.
objective. And you're
Right.
aligning means and ends. And you're right. It could go a couple different ways. And one way could be unproductive, and one way could be very productive. We've covered a lot, Megan.
We have, yes.
I liked the book a lot, and I've seen other things you did on other podcasts. That's how I first came across you as a podcast, and some of your things on YouTube. So I loved the frankly put thing in your book. Remember the letter, the email you?
Yes.
I really did, and
That was a real letter, Lou. That was a real letter I got.
but Megan, I read it like because you opened it up by saying the most negative comment you got, and I read it a couple of times, and I thought, that's not that negative. And then, then you followed it on with your reaction to it. I just thought that it was very telling. It was almost like whoever that was thought they were being it was like they thought they were being critical but couldn't. Like they couldn't get it out in a critical. I didn't take it in a critical way. I thought it was more revealing about them than it was about what you had written.
Well, I did too. It was really somebody who was sort of saying, what could I possibly have to learn from someone younger, like you silly girl, was sort of like the tone. And,
That was the
to me, I
implication.
thought, perfect, right? Like, perfect. You just proved my point. And I get that not infrequently, and it's always sort of the person standing at the back of the room with their hands in their pockets. Like, I just don't see why you think they can teach me anything. And it's like, exactly. Right? Exactly. Then that's where we start, because you really don't understand how this could even be possible. And that's very different, Lou, than you saying, this totally makes sense. It's not hard. It's not that difficult. We're not that far away from it. Everyone can do this. If you actually do fundamentally believe that we all have something to teach and something to learn, then right, it's not hard
Well,
at all. It's just a matter of doing it.
the organization most traditionally associated with command and control is the military. You have rank, it's your privilege to give an order. There's so many people I've worked with in government consulting who came out of the military, and so many of them would say that's just not how we do it. You can, and in certain situations you should. In so much else that didn't have to do with combat. I asked a retired colonel, about it one time, having the right and the responsibility to give an order. I said, is that a good or bad way to get something done? Megan, are more of a team project kind of activity. He said, that's the worst way to get something done. So the military had come up with, for a long time now, commander's intent, which you probably know about or have heard of. And the idea of the commander articulating what the mission will be, the objectives, and how success would be measured, the what and the why. and letting the team, whatever that unit is, figure out the how. And you alluded to that, something we were talking about almost, very early
Yes.
in our conversation. And then there's a particular one that if you're interested in this, you should look up. A guy named David Marquette, who has retired from the Navy and has his own consulting practice doing basically commander's intent, but what he calls intent-based leadership. And he tells a hysterical story how he came up with this notion where he studied for a year to take command of a ship, and shortly before he took command of it, they switched ships on him, and he literally knew nothing about the ship that he was getting on to take command of at that time. And he tells the story first of giving a command about steering or speed that couldn't be followed because there wasn't a setting for it. And he repeats the command a couple times, and then he asks the young man sitting at the controls, "Why aren't you doing what I said?" And he said, "Because, sir, there's no three-quarter power." He didn't know the ship. And he tells the story of talking to his leadership team of an inspection coming up and what were they going to do. And they got back to him and said, "We thought about it and we think we have the answer. We think that you should just shut up." And he says, "But commanders don't shut up. It's not what we do. We talk, we direct, we give orders, we give instructions." He said, "I thought about it and I realized they were right. I didn't know enough to pass the inspection, and they did." And it led him to rethinking how he gave orders, all except for the order to fire a weapon. He stopped giving orders, Megan. He stopped saying, "What do you think we should do? Why that? What might go right? What might go wrong?" He completely changed the conversation with his immediate leadership team and engaged them in a completely different way. Then they cascaded that down, according to the story he tells, it got to the engine room where guys were now having different conversations about everything they did and understanding how it increased their understanding of how things were connected, of how an action they took was going to impact something or be impacted by something, and they were exchanging information about that when those were never conversations they had. If you follow an order, you don't have to have that conversation. You just turn around and do what you were told. But if you're being asked, "We need to be somewhere by a certain time, or we need to accomplish a certain objective, how do you think we ought to do it?" And the people who are involved in that, even in layers, start having different conversations about their piece of it, so much more information surfaces. So much more information is processed by people. And he said inside of a year, the entire ship was working that way. And the following year, they went from being one of the worst in the Navy to the inspection to being the first in the Navy.
Wow.
And it's these kinds of things that, like you said it a second ago, which made me think of David Marquette. You said, if you fundamentally believe that people have things to contribute and learn, then there are ways to get at that. If you don't,
You won't.
yeah. What are you working on next?
So my next book is going to be on how to integrate age into your DE&I strategy. So I just sort of not entirely different, obviously, but just
Focused
realized,
on that.
Yeah, with the Harvard piece, they would very much wanted it to be titled around age versus generations, which obviously connected but different. And in sort of getting the word out on that, one of my assistants said, no one's really got their teeth into the age diversity space. The generations, there's lots of stuff buzzing around there, but you get a different audience in the conversation when you're talking about age diversity.
Interesting.
Maybe people who feel disconnected or stereotyped by the generational conversation are interested in the age conversation. So I'm
Wow.
trying to figure out. Yeah, I've been reaching out to hopefully talk with some organizations who are doing this really well, because I get a lot of questions like, who's got this figured out? And so I've been trying to really connect to do some interviews there. Looking at how age is looked at in the workplace around the world is really interesting. I want to incorporate that into the book. So that's my next book project, probably long term, but I'm going to take my time on it because I love writing. So that's what's next, I think.
Well, you said this one was phenomenally challenging. What did you mean by that?
It was the hardest thing. I mean, that I said that before I wrote the Harvard Business Review article, which might have been harder.
Okay. Fair.
Only because it was a lot of pressure, as you would imagine. There's a lot of eyes on that. It was hard, and I think it was hard in an amazing way, because I learned a lot.
Sure.
Like we were constantly hitting things where I thought, is that right? Do we understand it? What else do we need to find to understand this? there's so much that goes into writing a book that I didn't realize, right? Like, and if I wanted to just write an academic book, that would
Sure.
be easy because, I mean, anybody will let me write an academic book, but nobody will read it. That's the problem. And so I wanted something, I kept saying
More
I
broad
wanted
appeal. Yeah.
an airport bookstore book where you
Yeah.
would grab as you're going to catch a
Right.
plane. Like
Right.
that was my
Yeah,
goal.
exactly.
And so how do you do that in a way that does justice to the research and is well supported, so the smart people who are in the know about the research read it and go, yeah, that's good, but then the smart business people who are out there doing it every day don't say, well, what the hell does she know? She's an academic, right? Like, how do you keep your foot on both sides of that? Was this great challenge.
I bet it
I
was.
loved it. It was phenomenally rewarding, but it was very difficult.
I'm sure it was.
Like, just to get it right. Like, how much is too much? Like, what's missing? Is it clever? Is it interesting? Is it, it was just, it was great. It was very hard.
I think you
but
nailed
in a
it.
good way.
I think you nailed it.
Thank you.
I
appreciate
I do a
that.
lot of reading. Seriously, I do a lot of reading of books like yours. I do some reading of journals. I think you nailed the sweet spot of applicable research. A lot of what I read explains what and why very well. Some of it explains some how, but there's levels and layers of how. And I think for business leaders, including government organizational leaders, they read something and have to figure out, I like this. I think I could use this. I'll go in on Monday. Where do I start? What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't leave them asking. You didn't leave me asking that question. So you took it
Good.
from things that were conceptual to things that were very actionable, which is actually the first thing I said about your post 2 months ago. I said, this is very actionable stuff. I was just sharing it. And that was the word I used. Now, on the book, you also covered a lot of, sort of laterally, a lot of territory, from things about generations to the framework. And then when you went on into the people strategy and culture, you covered a lot of ground. You gave yourself a big challenge to write to a lot of things.
Yeah, it was quite the, it's so funny. My agent, when we started, and I gave her the proposal, and she said, can you really write like 9 or 10 chapters on this? I was like, I bet I could. And that was one of the big lessons I learned, though. Like, if you're going to write a book, you better love it and have a lot to say, because, there's a lot to dig into. And then it's a question of, like you said, how much is too much ground to cover versus, yeah, people would want to hear more on this, and where do you stop? And I love all of that. I find it really fascinating.
Yeah, I think you did a great job. I'm a big fan, and I've talked about it on LinkedIn. It's where we met. I think you and your colleagues have done some great stuff, and I hope you do very well with it.
Thank you. Appreciate you helping me spread the word, for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time and all your thoughts on this. It's great stuff.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
You bet. Of course.
Thanks, Megan. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's how we see it, my friends. I want to thank Megan for recording today's episode. You can find it at iseewhatyoumean.castos.com, plus all the usual places. Send questions and suggestions through your app. Subscribe and give me a 5-star rating unless you can't, in which case, let me know why. And join me next week when we take another look at how to get on the same page and stay there, unless we shouldn't.